doing?
Now, remember during the trial in October, I had very short hair and no facial hair, and now
Yes.
Now he looks like a biker.
Now I look more like a criminal than I am.
Oh no.
Well, I sent you a text message yesterday about you guys getting on my visiting list for whatever prison I go to.
Oh, I didn't.
Did you see it, Rosie?
Yes, I texted you back.
Okay,
but I don't know if you got that
I'm saying
yet.
if you guys, I was going to go. I was hoping to go to a prison called Butner, which is just less than an hour north of where I live. So it would be easy for Mary and the kids to come see me. But Butner has now had 15 deaths of inmates and one of a staff person because of coronavirus. So, and this is the sad thing about this whole movement for justice going on now with Black Lives Matter and against police brutality, is that we're not paying any attention to the fact that prisoners and people in jail are all facing corona deaths for nonviolent crimes. So we're just allowing people to die instead of letting them out. And anyone who's in for a nonviolent crime should be let out right now. It's an absolute emergency. And instead, there's really very little public outcry that we're imposing the death sentence on people. And know this, that most people in prison are there because of substance abuse and mental illness.
Right.
A very small percentage are there because they're sociopaths or really violent or murderers or rapists. It's not to say there aren't some of those there, but the vast majority of people in U.S. prisons, and we have 2.3 million people in prison in this country, the most in the world, is because of our punitive, system that just locks people up. And it's a shame that we do this. But I guess the thing that makes me sad is people are marching for Black Lives Matter and against police brutality, but we also should be marching to free all the people of color who are spending all this time in jail and prison, unable to socially isolate, and many people are dying. It's a sin. It's just sinful.
It is.
Yeah. So I try to remind people of this. I had a letter published in the Raleigh paper a couple of weeks ago when the 6th person at Butner died. He was a 73-year-old man. He had pre-existing medical problems, and his crime was marijuana distribution, and he died. So why wasn't he furloughed? I mean, why did you keep that man locked up? And they didn't even notify his family until they called up and said, what do you want us to do with his ashes? That was their first notification. So that's the prison I wanted to go to. So then there's not another one really that close to my house. I mean, I've been in prison in Atlanta twice, to the federal prison there. And I've been in Petersburg, Virginia, which is maybe 2.5 hours from my house. Atlanta's, closer to 7 or so, 8. But my daughter Bernadette lives in Atlanta, so I would have good visits. And she has my first granddaughter, Teresa, is there. So I get a lot of visits in Atlanta because I've been in prison there before. Still have friends. hey, he's back. I'm sure they have those little superlatives in your high school yearbook, most likely to succeed, most likely to be elected to something. The inmates would have voted me most likely to come back. No doubt about it. This is going to be my 4th federal prison sentence. So I know the system now.
Oh, wow. Well, it's so good to see your face, Patrick.
Nice to see you guys too. You actually are my biggest fan club, the 3 of you. So.
Love it.
And people who are convicted felons usually don't even have fan clubs. So think how fortunate I am.
We will always be your fan club.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, I've grown up in the nuclear age, right? Nuclear bomb, where I was born. So, I mean, my whole life was in the shadow of mass destruction, and there was the Vietnam War, and there was the 60s with all the opposition to it, and there was the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s. So I saw a lot of examples of how nonviolence. I mean, I remember the morning that I woke up and someone said Martin Luther King had been shot and killed, and a couple of months later, I was in boarding school. I woke up in the morning getting ready to go to Mass. I was at a Catholic boarding school. Robert F. Kennedy had been shot. I remember the day John Kennedy got shot. And so these historical events were pretty remarkable and incredible of our nation, right? So I remember as a child, my father had died in an accident. He was a construction worker, and he died in an accident in Manhattan on a building that was under construction. He was on the 19th floor and got knocked off the building and died. So my mother was at the age of 23 with two preschool age boys. And one of the things that happened during the Vietnam War, Rosie, was you could watch the evening news actually in the battlefields of Vietnam, filming in the midst of the killings. They were there. So you would have these live kind of TV reports every night, seeing aura of war, right, in color. And these two ticker tapes or count, and one counter was the number of U.S. troops who had and the total number of U.S. troops who had died during the Vietnam War. So you just news at 6 and 11 o'clock, and you'd see those numbers going up and up and up and up. And I remember my mother saying to my brother and I, when we were young, still, well, probably preteen and then teenagers, she would say to us, if this war is going on when you boys are old enough to be drafted, I'm taking you to Canada, my mother would say. So she sort of planted the seed in my mind. Well, this war must be wrong. I mean, my mother's rejecting it. She's my mother, right? And she sees that it's wrong. So I ended up being just kind of looking at things with a more critical eye because of that. And I was against the war. And I can remember arguing as a teenager with some of my friends in my opposition to the Vietnam War. And, by the time I was, in my teenage years, I didn't really have any theological understanding of pacifism or what it meant, but I knew that I didn't want to go to war and kill strangers. I didn't have any desire to be killed or to kill. And I was reading the New York Times as a kid, and was reading about the Berrigans and their anti-war work, and I was following the more militant groups that weren't necessarily committed to violence, but Abby Hoffman and the Chicago Aid, and reading the historical context of that. So eventually all of this just pointed toward nonviolence as being the only option. And then when I lived with Father Mulholland and then started getting more deeply interested in the theology of nonviolence, right? And there's a theology of nonviolence. Now, not everybody believes in it, but there certainly is a theology of nonviolence. That just became more and more central to who I was as a Catholic. And then, of course, because of the people I was hanging out with, it wasn't just theoretical.
I know that this action was really, no matter what the other side says, was very rooted in nonviolence, and that you really study nonviolence. And so I was wondering, what does nonviolence mean to you?
Well, I remember one time when I was at the Mary House, they have a Friday night round table there, and they invite speakers of some renown to come. In fact, Kathy Kelly has been a speaker, so you'll get to talk to her, and she's quite a remarkable woman of faith and an activist. But the question that often gets posed to pacifists, and it's probably already been posed to you, or if you say to somebody, well, here's an example. You can ask Sister Helen Bergeon about this. But someone will ask somebody who's against the death penalty, and the first thing someone will say to you, what if they killed your mother? Like they use this worst case scenario to see whether or not, are you saying that you wouldn't want revenge on the person who killed your mother? What if they raped her too? So what they do is a horrific case, and they personalize it in such a way that they want to test you, right? It's like the testing that Jesus always gets. They want a pacifist to see how crazy he is, how far will he go or she. So Bishop Gumbleton was the speaker at the round table at Mary House that night, and he gets the $64,000 question. So you're a pacifist. What would you Hitler? What would you have done about Hitler? So that's the question pacifists always get. What would you have done about Hitler or Mussolini? So you kind of use the historical example of the greatest, most violent people, in human history as an example of, well, wouldn't you kill them? Wouldn't you take up a weapon against them to stop them? So Bishop Gumbleton paused for a few seconds and pondered the question. And then he said to the person in reply, the time may come when the Christian has to be willing to die before we kill. Now that's un-American, Rosie. That's not what Americans want to hear. That you have to be willing to lose your life before you could take a life. But that is really the essence and the substance of what Jesus taught, right? To lay down your life for a friend, not to take a life for a friend. So therein really lies the problem, is when you've neglected for so long the rights and the needs of others, you create a very, very, it ends up becoming a really violent culture, because people are tired of being abused. They're tired of being oppressed. And so violence is the consequence of the absence of love. We're not loving each other and loving God and loving our neighbor. If we're not loving one another, then there's an absence of God and there's an absence of love, because God is love. It's all very logical, really, theologically. So nonviolence makes perfect sense in that context. If you follow Jesus, the Prince of Peace, who happens to be God, who happens to be love, well, then we just love one another. That's the deal. But one of the things I'm going to say at the beginning of my sentence statement is that, I haven't decided exactly how to word it yet, but basically to say, I hope to never be vindicated. I hope that nuclear weapons never are used, that global warming is not true, that I'm just a fool, because if I am vindicated, I don't want to think about what the consequences are going to be like for your generation, Rosie, or my grandchildren's generation. Because if the worst case scenarios develop, it means horrific things for future generations. So I said, I hope to be a fool. I hope to be wrong. I don't ever want to be right. I hope all you people who are prosecuting us, that we're illogical, that we were fools. So I'm going to turn the tables on them, and say, this is what I hope. I don't hope to ever be right. I hope I'm wrong. And that's truly how I feel. I have 8 children and 2 grandchildren, and probably will have a lot more grandchildren. And that's how I feel. I don't want the world to have a temperature rise that will basically result in calamities and people not being able to grow food, or the sun not to shine enough or shine too much, or hurricanes and tsunamis and all kinds of natural disasters to get worse and worse. I don't want to have nuclear winter. I don't want nuclear weapons to be used. But the point is, everything that we're doing is pointing in that direction. We're taking these risks. It's not even just it's not even the risk of loss of life. We're tinkering with the human experiment. We're tinkering with God's creation. It's a much more corporate sin than just doing things that are risky. This is over the top. It's not. We're building weapons that destroy entire cities. what would Jesus do?
Definitely
Jesus,
not that.
well, Jesus weeps. That's what Jesus does. Jesus weeps over our desecration of creation. Jesus weeps over it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. What would Jesus do? You got it.